Welcome and thank you very much for joining us in this series of talks. So we wanted to look at the landscapes of housing in different and complementary ways from the talks given at our symposium on housing last November. And those recordings are available from our FOLA website. So in the first talk, we visited government and local authority archives with Catherine Flynn to learn about the many published planning proposals and goals which were set out from 1943 onwards, and then how funding the reconstruction of blitzed cities and housing was continuously undermined and in secrecy for years and years by a Treasury committee. In our second talk, we've had Luis Diaz showing us 100 ways in which architects have designed the approach from pavement to front door, the last bit of our journey home. And this included practical, designerly, and some very pleasing ideas. Mostly they've been added to or altered by residents for better or worse. But the level and quality of design has diminished more recently, perhaps because of new regulations and/or different types of developers and landlords. So now there is less interest or awareness by developers in aesthetics, but also in the significance of the journey to and from home for all ages in the household. Last week, we stepped back and John Boughton gave a speedy and detailed history of many examples of different types of council housing and estates across the UK. There were many long threads running through his talk, like living conditions, money, the ambitions of different governments, but also some key stops or starts, including war and the perceived threat of a working class revolution, which triggered the change from philanthropic housing endeavours into large-scale developments, innovation and a nationwide government responsibility. Jan Woudstra showed us some examples in the Netherlands in the last talk. He set this against the background of a long history of city expansion outwards, but also of redevelopment arising from war and from cities' self-destruction in parts to accommodate new roads. And his examples were infill developments, architects challenging their briefs, it seemed, and developments fitting in with what families wanted. Subtle designs of more and less public outdoor spaces that you could read and understand the unwritten codes that were also full of interest and variation and flexibility. These were established and have been refurbished rather than pulled down within a different system of home ownership, and most importantly, where rents are fixed, and so people can and do grow old there. Our last talk in this series is from Assistant Professor Dr Otto Saumarez Smith, who will bring us back to the UK and to the new towns. And this was one of the talks that was part of the November FOLA Symposium. So Otto is a lecturer in architectural history at the University of Warwick. His most recent book is Boom Cities, Architect, Planners and the Politics of Radical Urban Renewal in 1960s Britain. He's currently researching and writing the End of Urban Modernism in the 1970s. He is a trustee and chair of the Casework Committee for the 20th Century Society, and a very active and informative contributor to Twitter about places and archives from all over the place. So Otto, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's very weird talking into the, of course, if I am talking to myself, I wouldn't know. So, shout if you can't hear. But thank you, everybody, for coming. So this talk grows out of a book chapter, a chapter for a book project I'm editing with Simon Gunn and Peter Mandler about the modern British city. It's going to be a really big book, and I'm extremely pleased with the talents we've got writing for us. One of the emerging themes is going to be the way that much of post-war urban history happened in places formed in the 19th century. My chapter for the book takes 3 case studies of urban landscapes that I found initially discombobulating and in need of some kind of historical exegesis. It needs more work to tie these case studies together, and I'm presenting the material here as a work in progress. and I'm looking for advice and help about how to do this. Thank you. So here we go. In 2001, the architect, theorist, and provocateur Cedric Price abbreviated the entirety of historical urban development into a diagram showing 3 eggs. Traditionally, cities have been tightly enclosed within their defensive walls, like a boiled egg in its shell. Industrialization had seen these walls break out, with the egg-white suburbs escaping from a still yolky city centre. The provocation came with a third egg, which has been scrambled, a viscous mixture of city and suburb, town and country, bound together by networks of roads, telephone wires, and electricity pylons. The Victorian city had been created out of the centralizing force of the railway, an industrial revolution based on access to raw materials, and the need for home and work to be in close proximity. Forces which were reversed through the centrifugal forces of electrification, deindustrialization, suburbanisation, and automatability. Cedric Price was an evangelist for this process. He was one of the authors of a special issue of New Society named Non-Plan, which argued that instead of trying to counter sprawl, it should be embraced as it grew out of people's aspirations and desires. As Non-Plan recognised, this had happened despite the fact that it was anathema to most 20th century commentators on cities, who instead called for higher densities, powered, as the planner William Holford saw it, by the utopian urge to reconstruct the core of the old metropolis, to bring order out of disorder, to counter sprawl by concentration, to create a symbol of efficiency, a welfare city in a welfare state, end quote. Cedric Price's provocations give the parameters for the issues I want to explore in this talk. Firstly, I want to track some of the ways in which the strict distinction between town and country were eroded in particular places after 1945. Secondly, I want to track the way people both celebrated and denigrated this process. Thirdly, I want to keep in sight the fact that these processes happen in places with existing environmental and architectural histories. I am not, like Cedric Price, an apostle for this history. I am more equivocal. It would be a mistake to ignore the profound changes these shifts have had for the social life of Britain in these years, not least the huge benefits to public health and infant mortality rates that accrued through lower densities. But there were winners and losers in this process, and this chapter links the scrambling of urban places with the process of deindustrialization, a key contributing factor to shifting urban morphology in many places. The 3 places I have chosen to explore these issues through show scrambling happening not just at the suburban edgelands of cities, but also right in the heart of conurbations. Another of Cedric Price's provocations was proposing the Royal Agricultural Show as his favourite city. This was his ideal, a briefly burning city on a tabula rasa, created from nothing and as ephemeral as a funfair. But British cities haven't developed like this. They are palimpsests of the hypermodern with historically freighted places. Even though cities have become scrambled, this scrambling is overlaid onto already existing places. Perhaps Britain's experience of urban change can best be likened to an omelette. Chunks of the old mixed in with the kind of scrambled mixture Cedric Price liked, but also defined by policies for containment. Even the 1970s new towns of Milton Keynes, Washington, or Telford, the closest actually existing places in Britain to Cedric Price's vision of hyper-decentralized modern cities, these places are overlain on top of places with existing histories. Telford is particularly instructive. As a brochure to the new town celebrated, on the one hand, you have a modern mixture of futuristic shopping centres, forward-looking factories, and multi-styled housing estates. On the other, there are the bare-bricked industrial ruins, the older villages and towns, numerous little pockets of meadow and woodland, and the much bigger areas of mature parkland, and the wilder wooded places of the Ironbridge Gorge. Telford is a jigsaw of different elements. End quote. Ironbridge was one of a number of former settlements swallowed up within the sprawling new town of Telford, which was designated in the 1960s to take overspill population from the West Midlands conurbation. Tourists visit Ironbridge for its museums and industrial heritage sites, as the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, and as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. I suspect many of them are surprised to find these historic industrial attractions embedded within such a lushly Arcadian landscape, in which the River Severn carves through steep wooded hills on which dark reddish-brown brick buildings precariously perch. There isn't a hint of the satanic here. Indeed, it's barely urban. Although the focus of visitors is exclusively on earlier historical sites, the landscape they experience is in large part the result of a forgotten late 20th century history. John Piper and John Betjeman had visited the area for the Shell Guide to Shropshire in 1951, and they found what they described as a broken and forlorn landscape of dead collieries, branch railways, tileworks and iron foundries, lying among waste heaps now and then left bare for a common, sinister pools of black water. End quote. Telford Newtown would transform this unsightly and dangerous mess into what the Development Corporation called a forest city. Telford was given a landscape plan that harnessed the vigorous forms left by dereliction, merging them with massive projects of earth moulding, tree planting, and new grassland. Using their own nursery, the Development Corporation planted in excess of 5 million trees, resulting in approximately 80 square meters of woodland for every single resident of the new city. Telford healed but did not erase the industrial past, as places resonant with industrial heritage within the designation, such as Ironbridge and Coalbrookdale, were restored and celebrated as an integral part of the Newtown project. Telford is an odd place to visit. It is spread out, car-dependent, and has so little urban grain it makes earlier new towns like Harlow or Stevenage feel like Paris or Rome. Telford gave many thousands of people a decent place to live and was an astonishingly ambitious and ecologically sophisticated response to deindustrializing landscapes. But these achievements are forgotten because they are largely invisible. You can't see the new town for the trees. There is, or was until recently, an exception to the relative invisibility of the profound late 20th century changes to this Shropshire landscape. This was Ironbridge B power station, which went online in 1969, with its 4 great 375-foot-high cooling towers grouped into a gentle sequence running alongside the contours of the wooded hillside that rises up from the River Severn. Ironbridge B was really big. The cooling towers of Ironbridge rise higher than the cross surmounting the dome of St Paul's Cathedral. The spire at Salisbury is only 29 foot higher than the Ironbridge cooling towers. Here is the similarly scaled chimney at Drax compared with York Minster, an invidious comparison as it turned out, as the acid rain caused by these power stations would wreck the Minster's external sculpture. Placed on a map of London, a 2,000 megawatt power station would stretch from Hyde Park Corner to Waterloo Station. Despite the enormous scale of the concrete of the cooling towers, the concrete is only 7 inches thick. Like an eggshell, it is the shape which gives it strength. Ironbridge B was one of 10 large set philosophy power stations that started construction in 1960 to 1963. nicknamed the Hinton Heavies after the chairman of the Central Electricity Board, Christopher Hinton. Rayner Banham described the Hinton Heavies as less of brick cathedrals than concrete bunkers, comparing them to the power stations of just a few decades previously, such as Giles Gilbert Scott's Battersea Power Station, which could almost be swallowed whole by a single 1960s cooling tower. These 1960s power stations share an aesthetic of stark concrete monumentalism with other massive building projects of this period, from tower blocks to shopping centres to new universities. Percy Thomas' partnership with the consultant architects at Ironbridge B and their Clifton Cathedral in Bristol shows that something of this aesthetic of bloody-minded a land affected ecclesiology just as much as electricity production. These power stations were perhaps the key monuments of the neophilia of the early 1960s, when both the Conservative and Labour parties appropriated the rhetoric of architectural modernism as part of their efforts to present themselves as capable of refashioning Britain along new modern lines, through a re-emphasis on Keynesian government stimulus. The technocratic scientism of the period is manifested in the sleek control room of Ironbridge B. The electricity produced by the Hinton Heavies would literally fuel the outward signs of affluence that were transforming British social life in this time period, illuminating television and powering washing machines. The 1957 Electricity Act had made it a statutory duty for the Central Electricity Generating Board to minimise the impact of power stations on the surrounding environment, the so-called amenity clause. Whether or not you see an abstractly humanoid presence in cooling towers, there is definitely something elementally graceful about the way that they make heavy concrete visually light through a tender hyperboloid curve. Beautiful on their own terms or not, it took the project's landscape architect, Kenneth Booth, much ingenuity to integrate these gigantic forms into the surrounding landscape, so that they almost appear to grow naturally out of the hillside. Booth's approach to this seemingly impossible task was heavily influenced by the advice set out in Sylvia Crowe's romantically written 1958 book, The Landscape of Power. Cooling towers were one of a number of revolutionary new shapes necessitated by mass electrification, whose scale is cosmic rather than terrestrial, and the idea which its appearance should express is the harnessing of universal forces to the service of the earth. These shapes are unlike any previous man-made structure. Their scale and lines of construction link them with the mind and force of the universes, and not at all with the human body." End quote. She advised that as it was impossible to conceal them, it was best to divorce them from any surrounding humanizing detail, so that it could become enveloped by the surrounding countryside, thereby becoming as impersonal as hills. At Ironbridge B, the smaller scale ancillary buildings were therefore screened by trees and new hills created out of excess spoil. Eat your heart out, Capability Brown. The coup de théâtre at Ironbridge B was the subdued ochre colouring of the cooling tower's concrete. The initial plan was to colour the towers a khaki green, so that they would be camouflaged amongst the surrounding verdant hillside. Booth reputedly had the eureka moment whilst looking at the site from atop the nearby Wrecking Hill, when he noticed the ferrous colour of a recently ploughed field. The palette makes me think of John Ruskin's argument, his proto-ecological 1858 lecture, The Work of Iron in Nature, Art and Policy, that so much of the beauty of English landscape and building was due to the presence in their composition of iron ochre. The colour also hints at the fiery glow of industry, as depicted in paintings of the gorge in its late 18th century heyday. Why was Ironbridge built in a Shropshire gorge? For the very same reason that this area was the heart of the Industrial Revolution: access to water and access to coal. Coal to power the generator and water to cool the process. Each cooling tower handled 400 million gallons of water an hour. It was hoped that the Hinton Heavies would revive an ailing coal industry. There is an irony here, though, as electricity was a fundamental cause of Britain's deindustrialisation and the resulting geographic social polarisation, as it made Britain's industrial heartlands increasingly irrelevant, as jobs and prosperity went south with the pylons. Coal and electricity were two industries that had been nationalised after the Second World War, meaning that Ironbridge B would be at the centre of the political upheavals of the 1970s and 1980s, as a photograph of a woman eating by candlelight during a 1972 blackout illustrates. Ironbridge B was intimately tied to its landscape, but it was built during a period where architecture was becoming increasingly divorced from its environment. Electricity meant that buildings could have deeper plans because of electric lighting, and heating or cooling could be achieved by artificial means. Prefabricated building systems broke the intimate relationship between a location and its building that had been celebrated by Ruskin and those influenced by him, from Philip Webb to Alec Clifton Taylor. Ironbridge B was demolished in December 2019. When detonated, cooling towers make a final little dance, looking for a moment like fluttering fabric as they collapse into themselves, emitting a mighty wave of dust. Changes in the way electricity is produced mean that all power stations are currently on the way out. Buildings accrue meaning over the course of their lifespan. What in the 1960s could be construed as a symbol of spreading prosperity and home comfort has become a signal to the profligacy of that era. Perhaps we should simply celebrate the passing of these megalithic monuments to a polluting and energy-guzzling past. As Marina Warner argued, cooling towers symbolize heedless, overflowing consumption with an ironic economy of form. Even in the 1970s, the landscape architect Brenda Colvin thought that there might be something ecologically suspect about finding beauty in a cooling tower. But as she argued, those of us who have come to appreciate the remarkable beauty of these new forms and their dramatic sculptural quality remember that art has been inspired by battle scenes, by air raids, and by Rome in flames. All these, like the sculpture of new technology, may appeal to the eye, if not to the mind. The disappearance of the power station at Ironbridge is particularly poignant. This is a place that, through an active programme of conservation, succeeded in transforming a derelict landscape of industry into a landscape of tourism and heritage, although not for the 20th century. Historic England's advice to date has been that cooling towers are not distinctive enough to deserve protection. Okay. And now for my second section. This section explores the St Hilda's area of Middlesbrough, a place I visited for the first time in spring 2022, whose urban fabric I found extremely confusing. North Yorkshire is one of the last counties of the buildings of England to have been revised, though it has now come out. So I was armed only with the 1966 Pevsner, which advised I start my perambulations in the marketplace of the originally laid out town north of the station. What I found there was bizarre. The old town hall of 1846 survives, but it is derelict and shut up. All around is wasteland. It is a deeply disconcerting place. I have since discovered that I was, as often, travelling in the footsteps of another flaneur, Owen Hatherley, who fittingly described the lonely 1840s town hall amongst huge, yawning, open scrubland, looking out towards cooling towers. Short of doubling for a post-apocalyptic film set, it's hard to see what exactly this place is becoming, what exactly is being done here, what the purpose of the clearance of its population. Unquote. The architectural critic, Ian Nairn, has a quote I aspire to, that whereas people normally go to town centres to shop or to have a meal, I go there to read them like a detective novel, to try and unravel what has gone wrong, what has gone right, how the shape is. End quote. St. Hilda's was a crime scene. Who was the murderer? I had 4 witnesses, an historian, a painter, a sociologist, and an architect planner. I started my investigation with a chapter on Middlesbrough in Asa Briggs's 1963 book, Victorian Cities. This is a bravura piece of history writing, which uses the boosterish high rhetoric of Victorian polemic to convey the sheer excitement of a place which in 1829 had a population of only 40 people, and by 1901 had grown to over 19,000. Briggs's book is written in declared opposition to Lewis Mumford's characterization of insensate industrial towns. And he wanted the reader to share in the vitality of these places that excited contemporaries. Gladstone famously described Middlesbrough as that infant Hercules. Briggs describes the forces that created this concatenation of people. First, the arrival of the Stockton and Darlington Railway in 1830. Secondly, the discovery of iron ore in the Cleveland Hills. And thirdly, the need for workers to live in close proximity to their work. Photographs of St. Hilda's in the 19th century capture something of the quality that led Briggs to describe Middlesbrough as the British Ballarat. But, as Briggs explains, St. Hilda's wasn't just the Wild West, but was a paternalistically planned area, writing that it is a tragedy that in an age of deliberate new town building, this fascinating example of 19th century town planning has been almost destroyed in recent years. In his introduction, Briggs defines the period covered by Victorian cities as between the coming of the railway and the coming of the automobile. Where the railway had led to the concentration of urban populations, the automobiles scattered the cities, pushing them further and further away from their mid-Victorian centres to new suburbs. 1963, when Victorian Cities was published, was the year that symbolically traffic accidents overtook tuberculosis as the biggest cause of death. It was also the year of Colin Buchanan's report, Traffic in Towns, and Briggs specifically asked whether his own generation might be able to match the confidence of the Victorian railway builders when integrating motorways into cities. It is perhaps also suggested for 20th century forces that 1963 is also the year that Briggs himself, a classic Hogarthian scholarship boy from Keighley, moved from civic northern Leeds University to the modern southern University of Sussex. My second witness is the painter John Piper, who visited Middlesbrough in 1946, which through his eyes was still essentially a Victorian city, although he advised that it was for atmosphere rather than architecture that the student of the 19th century should visit this smoke-pickled place. As the founder with John Betjeman of the Shell Guides, Piper was an early enthusiast for the Victorian, and at Middlesbrough, he was especially keen on the pubs. The rise of the Gin Palace coincided with the rise of Middlesbrough, and its pubs deserve a monograph, he wrote. It's still to be written. He recommended a tourist to Middlesbrough walk along the slag tips, as these were the only landmass above 16 or 20 foot above sea level. He wrote, beyond the foreground of grey and red ochre slag, and beyond the broken Port Clarence works, lies Middlesbrough, again in its brown haze, with blackened St. Hilda's spire, Victorian towers and cupolas, and the handsome transporter bridge, making the horizon more prickly than it already is, with its chimneys and bath furnaces and colliery gear. He painted the scene. Piper also visited St. Hilda's. His description of it matches Owen Hatherley's of 70 years later for post-apocalyptic prose. Today, the square of St. Hilda's is one of the most industrial town sites. It is deserted, shops are boarded up, many houses windowless, many lots vacant. Dust swirls in the wind past the unpainted housefronts. It looks as if a plague has visited it. This is not the effect of depression or of war and bombs. Middlesbrough has been little bombed, but the result of the rapid and uncontrollable growth of the place, which induced the running up of subsidiary rows of houses in parallel streets between the original ones, so that the whole district developed into an uninhabitable slum and has now ceased to be a centre of population. My third witness is sociologist Ruth Glass, who published her study of Middlesbrough, Social Background to a Plan, in 1946. She agreed with Piper and Briggs that the central fact of the town and of its problem was its 19th century development. But not only are Middlesbrough's problems now all intertwined, but they all derive from one common cause, 19th century laissez-faire. Uncontrolled development has caused all the cumulative maladjustments. It has continually widened the social cleavages within the town. It cannot be allowed to persist. St Hilda's was at the butt of this process. Hemmed in on the north by the Ironmasters district, the docks and the River Tees, the town has sprawled southward. The more prosperous family was, the farther out did it move away from the original centre of the town. The poor people were left there, on either side of the railway, living in rows and rows of little brown streets, in cottages which were cheaply and hastily built by the jerry builders of the last century. While suburbia spread out, the old town deteriorated, so that by now most of it is a blighted area and urgently in need of reconstruction. She nevertheless contrasted the sociability of the slums with that of the spacious and barren suburbs, which she described as shapeless, disjointed, and frigid. Ruth Glass's work was done as part of a wartime plan by the architect-planner Max Locke. This plan brought together an astonishing range of multidisciplinary expertise, a collection of scimitar minds, in Locke's phrase. Women, including Justin Blanco-White, Jacqueline Tyrwhitt, and Mary Crowley, later Med, a veritable roster of the first generation of trained female architects, who have been chronicled by Lynn Walker and Elizabeth Darling. My witness here is going to be the architect-planner Jessica Albury, who did the survey and planning of St Hilda's, as well as the section on housing. In an unpublished short autobiography, Albury describes the experience as a turning point in my life, both as an exercise in democratic consultation and for the insight I obtained into the nature of the industrial north and the history of the steel industry. She explained that the broken windows, slateless roofs, and empty buildings of St Hilda's are plain for all to see. On every side of the small enclave, formed by the residential area of St Hilda's, have spread the activities of the heavy steel industry. Steelworks, blast furnaces, railway lines, docks. The air is heavily polluted by smoke at a concentration of over 450 tons per square mile per annum. 98% of the population wanted to move to another house. 60% wanted to live amongst new neighbours. It had already suffered massive population decline, from 12,400 people in the 1931 census to an estimated 6,500 post-war, although still at a net residential density of 230 persons per acre, with 83% of houses without a bath. There was only 0.5 acres of open space per 1,000 persons. Health statistics, especially infant mortality rates, were the worst in the town. Albury concluded that, I quote, "It is certain that the whole neighbourhood is in such a state of dilapidation that only entire clearance and rebuilding in a single operation will enable the rehabilitation to take place." Between 1955 and 1985, 1.5 million houses in Britain were demolished through some clearance measures, displacing around 3.66 million people. The Victorian rows of working class housing, which had been the focus of enormous levels of state intervention throughout the middle years of the 20th century, the symbol of everything that political progressives were fighting against, has since gained a nostalgic sheen as sites of traditional close-knit community, which had been destroyed through slum clearance, celebrated from sociology to soap operas. The archive is silent on such issues in Middlesbrough, but in St Hilda's, the public health benefit of clearance seemed incontrovertible. Eric Christopher Downer, Chief Medical Officer, wrote of the houses in the compulsory purchase area, "They are, in my judgment, unfit for human habitation, utterly incapable of being rendered so fit at reasonable cost. And I am of the opinion that the most expedient way of dealing with the house in this area is that the demolition of the lot with a view to possible redevelopment of the site." When demolition had started, the borough engineer advised that nothing should be salvaged from the houses and all the woodwork burned. It is far from being a matter of vermin or lice alone. There are bugs and there is woodworm, and one simply does not want any of that wood moved about or taken, possibly into other houses, to start the whole business up again, when we are, by slum clearance, attempting to stamp that sort of thing out. Albury proposed a small community of 2,250 people on the site. "There is no room here for a garden city," she wrote, "but while maintaining the spacious character of the original plan, it will be possible by the provision of 3-story blocks of flats for 2-person and some 3-person families, together with hostels for single families." End quote. Now, this was the moment of surprise in my research. Albury's neighbourhood plan more or less came to pass, although 9/10 of the demolition happened after 1958. One of the very few photographs I can find of the scheme shows a classic pedestrian precinct, with the Victorian town hall turned into a health clinic. Underneath my feet, in the wasteland that St Hilda's had become, were buried 2 victims: the Victorian city that I had been searching for, and a post-war cityscape that had vanished without a trace. Talk about the brief life of social democracy. The 1980s saw some of its own attempts at regeneration of an area it saw as already suffering severe social and environmental problems, including the building of houses for sale. These were completed as late as 1987, but they too have disappeared. There was also a scheme which converted what were described as a series of typical but highly unpopular balconyettes as flats by giving them a more homely image through pitched roofs and vernacular stylings, and changing the landscape to create defensible space, with communal spaces between blocks attractively landscaped and closed off as cul-de-sacs. All of this is also gone. The building of the A66 flyover in 1986 further isolated St Hilda's from the rest of the town. North Middlesbrough, including St Hilda's, was rebranded Middlehaven in 1986, following the 1980 closure of the nearby docks. I think clearance can be tied to a moment in the late 1990s, when Middlesbrough was attempting to attract private investment for property development, although Will Alsop's grandiloquently iconic Middleshaven plan for the nearby dock site came to nothing. A vicar who left the area in 1995, which she described then as a thriving, vibrant community with some pride, returned to find it cleared in 2000. It happened over a short period of time, 5 years, that's all. When I came back, I couldn't believe it. The decay of St Hilda's has not been over decades. It has been swifter and more devastating for it. There is a current plan for the site, pushed for by the boosterish mayor of Middlesbrough, Andy Preston, who told The Guardian recently, when it comes to places like Middlesbrough, with decades of master plans, they've all got one thing in common: they never happen. St Hilda's is an extreme petri dish of urban change, a grim cycle of architectural harikiri. The layers of change in St Helens map comfortably onto the way we commonly periodize change in the post-war period, not least in urban history, through a move from a social democratic to a neoliberal polity. The post-1945 St Hilda's, created by experts and borne aloft by modernism, certainly looks like the welfare state in concrete. Middlesbrough's botched attempts to pitch for ethereal global development capital to compensate for a devastated industrial sector also looks a lot like neoliberalism. I don't want to totally discount this social democracy to neoliberalism line as a meta-narrative, especially as Middlesbrough was clearly at the sharp end of a post-1979 political settlement. But the case study, I think, also points to another meta-narrative for understanding historical change since 1945, the long unravelling of Victorian urban structures. All of my witnesses agreed that the overriding facts of Middlesbrough in the post-war period were the aftershock of its 19th century history. One last vision of St Hilda's is the astonishing balsa wood model of the area made recently by amateur historian and model maker Steve Waller. It is based on Victorian maps, but with its bunting and Morris miners, appears to be set in a prelapsarian post-war period, which of course never existed. The utopian imaginary of mixing urban and countryside that underlays so many of the attempts to reform the dense Victorian city from Ebenezer Howard onward, ironically has ended up here with a different merging of nature and the urban, a wasteland. No wonder, perhaps, that we long for the Victorian city. Case number 3. Deindustrialisation has been posited as the key meta-narrative for understanding post-war British history. But it was a process that can be tracked not just in the economic data of job losses and closing factories, but as a process which inscribed itself onto landscapes. A 1961 photograph of the euphoniously named Etruria Hall in Stoke-on-Trent, which had been the home of the celebrated 18th century potter, Josiah Wedgwood, shows the house forlorn amongst the Shelton iron and steel works, with the gigantic Hanley-deep pit slag heap looming behind. As Pesner wrote from the site, from his house, Wedgwood could look across landscape to the canal, inspired by him, and the works built by him. Now that view is all desolation. For Pesner, Stoke-on-Trent was an urban tragedy. Here is the seat of a national industry. Here is the 14th largest city in England. And what is it? Mean little towns hopelessly connected now by factories, by streets of slummy cottages, or by better suburban houses. Here is no centre to the whole, not even an attempt at one. Stoke-on-Trent has long been a city which mixed the urban and the rural in disconcerting ways. It is a polycentric city, being composed of 6 towns rather than the 5 towns immortalised by the novelist Arnold Bennett. Although as the potteries, its most famous industry is ceramics, the reason for this form is that 5 of the 6 towns follow the thin line of the Staffordshire coal seams, mined in the great pits at Chatley-Whitfield, Snaid, Norton, Racetrack, Hanley Deep, and Florence collieries. For every ton of clay needed by Wedgwood, he needed 10 tons of coal. The poet Charles Tomlinson was born in 1927 in Stoke-on-Trent and grew up overlooking Etruria, and his attempt to capture the genius loci of the place stressed its formlessness. It straggles a haggard valley and lets through discouraged greenness by ash tips, or where the street gives out in cindery in-betweens. The hills swell upland free of it to where, behind the whole vapory patchfield battlefield, the cows stand steaming in an acrid wind. The strangeness of this landscape was perhaps best captured by Leonard Griffith Brammer's interwar etchings, which show a now largely lost landscape of tightly knit towns rising like islands from desolate wastelands and peopled by Lowry-esque shaft pickers under heavily polluted skies, smudgely depicted. Brammer was particularly good at recording the strange shapes of bottled smoking kilns, like so many monstrous bottles. At its peak, just before the Second World War, 2,000 bottle kilns stood, dominating the landscape. Today, there are only 47. W.G. Hoskins's guidebook, The East Midlands, written for the About Britain series, provocatively juxtaposed aerial shots of Stoke and Oxford. And although the comparison is meant by Hoskins to disadvantage Stoke, it suggests the industrial sublimity of this urban landscape. Had more of this landscape been preserved, potteries would have been in a better position to make a heritage asset of its industrial history. Nevertheless, even in a place where considerable built fabric survives, such as at the beautiful Spode Works, famous for producing iconic blue and white china, which only ceased production in 2008, the buildings are now empty and deteriorating. A 2011 local master plan imagines the Spode Works reused to house market-style retailing with the atmosphere of a bazaar, a museum, artist studios, galleries, and creative workspaces. The models cited for such regeneration are Neal's Yard in Covent Garden and Camden Lock. The reinterpretation of the value of Victorian buildings from a slum into a commodity is a remarkable change of the last 50 years. But in a country with growing regional social polarization, location is immensely important for how these processes played out. This is as true for the everyday terraced house as for grand factories. Victorian or Edwardian houses were being sold for ever-increasing amounts of money in Hackney or Camberwell, while structurally indistinguishable terraces were being demolished as unsellable in places like Stoke-on-Trent through the Housing Market Renewal initiative, which ran from 2002 to 2011. Arnold Bennett describes Stoke's smoky atmosphere as transforming ugliness into a beauty transcending the works of architects in time. The smoke has gone with the kilns, thanks in large part to the Clean Air Act of 1956 and the implementation of smoke control zones of 1959 and 1972. Margaret Drabble, in her 1975 biography of Arnold Bennett, reminisced about returning to Sheffield, where she spent her childhood. I was expecting to look out of the window and see those soul-destroying, grim industrial perspectives, but in fact I looked out. The sun was shining, the hillsides were glittering, green fields ringed the horizon. It was all bright and sparkling and beautiful. I felt as if I had maligned the place complete in my memory. A similar change has of course overtaken Stoke-on-Trent. Burslem no longer appears from the height of Snade Green to lie in a heavy pool of smoke. An amateur photographer and historian of Stoke explained that he had to wait until the Wakes Week in 1953 to capture this view of Victoria, as it was invisible the rest of the year. Like much of the landscape of Stoke-on-Trent, the view that Pevsner took in from Etruria Hall, now a Best Western hotel, has totally transformed. The city retains the feeling of sudden juxtaposition, though, of two sudden contrasts between the urban running out into awkward greenery or dereliction. During the 1970s, the slag heap would become the centerpiece of the Forest Park. The landscape architects here molded rather than flattened the slag heaps of Stoke and aimed for an ecologically rich stretch of landscape countryside with the life cycles and sights of sounds and sights and smells of the countryside. In 1978, Bill Moreland's portrait of the potteries could describe the changes happening to Stoke-on-Trent with excitement. The most obvious change in the landscape, he wrote, is in the landscape, he wrote. Mole holes are now fields and ornamental lakes. Pit heaps have vanished. There is no longer a pool of smoke over the valleys. A brave new face is beginning to smile through the moonscape of the past. End quote. Stoke-on-Trent has the most green space per inhabitant of any British city that was not a new town. But it is often scruffy and unmanicured urban countryside. The Wedgwood factory had already moved out to suburban Barlaston in 1939, although parts of the ironworks continued to operate until 2000. Etruria was the site of the Second Garden Festival in 1986, an attempt by the then Conservative government to harness private development to reclaim derelict land for the property market. The Garden Festival's landscape of model gardens, cascades and rockeries was short-lived, and much of Etruria is now a retail park of large anonymous sheds. As Matthew Rice describes it, the area was subsequently turned into a new eyesore to replace the old industrial one, the worst sort of retail park with supermarkets and a multiplex cinema, all placed within a formless plan designed for car access only, and so with more buildings, more roads than buildings. Stoke, I'm afraid, has often elicited feelings of despair. When Richmond Crossman visited as Minister of Housing and Local Government in 1966, he wrote, "Here is this huge, ghastly combination of 5 towns. What sense is there in talking about urban renewal here? Other towns have a shape, a centre, some place where renewal can start, perhaps a university. If one spent millions on this ghastly collection of slag heaps, pools of water, old potteries, deserted coal mines, there would be nothing to show for the money." Unquote. Cedric Price, who this chapter started with, was from Stone, a town just to the south of Potteries, so he knew the landscape intimately. His grandfather ran a firm that created dyes for the pottery industry. He was also disparaging of it, writing that, as far as the physical environment goes, it is a disaster area, largely unchanged and uncared for since the 19th century. But with his Potteries Think Belt scheme of 1966 to 7, he imagined a new kind of civic mobile university geared towards lifelong learning, grafted onto this derelict landscape. In Price's imagination, Stoke's derelict acres wouldn't be returned to some prelapsarian urbanity. Indeed, he was explicit in wanting to avoid any idea of ideal towns or civic design. A photo montage used to illustrate the scheme provocatively shows his low-rise conglomeration of lightweight housing units placed amongst the wasteland of Hanley, the Snade tip rising behind. The housing units proposed by Price, with aggressive disrespect for conventional primness, would be named Sprawl, Battery, Capsule, and Crate, and were especially designed for siting on the subsidence-prone ground. The planners and architects of the 1960s were often criticised for giving up on tradition. Price, a fanatic neophiliac, attacked them from the opposite end, seeing the architectural production of the period as little better than the Middle Ages with electricity. Here's my conclusion. Potteries Think Belt never materialised, although it was prophetic about the need to find new identities for industrial communities. Price was also surely right that much of this new urban form would emerge out of the carcass of the old. We tend to tell the history of post-war Britain through a very limited range of places whose modernity is palpable. London, a limited number of inner city areas, the new towns, Blitz, Coventry, and large cities such as Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, Sheffield, Glasgow, and Liverpool. Most urban places in Britain don't look like Park Hill, or the Barbican, or Milton Keynes, or Cumbernauld. We need post-war urban histories of, inter alia, Chesterfield, Crewe, Derby, Dudley, Folkestone, Grimsby, Hartlepool, Keighley, Newport, Paisley, Port Talbot, Reading, Scarborough, Scunthorpe, Swindon, Tadcaster, Torbay, Watford, Wigan, and Wrexham. All of these towns are 19th century places, which, obviously, also have a late 20th century history. 20th century British history, 20th century British history didn't just happen in places that were new and modern, but as the geographer Doreen Massey recognised, I quote, "Amid the Ridley Scott images of world cities, the writing about skyscraper fortresses, the Baudrillard visions of hyperspace, most people actually live in places like Harlesden or West Brom. Much life for many people, even in the heart of the first world, still consists of waiting in a bus shelter with your shopping for a bus that never comes." Thank you very much. Is anybody still there?
I'm here, Otto. I'm just recuperating from that incredible talk, which was stuffed with fascinating and stimulating stuff. I'm also shocked at the fashions that are shown on your picture of the Stoke Garden Festival, which of course was very much part of my early adult life. Did I look like that at that age?
Sorry if I was over rude about it. I love that picture with the weird scale of the colliery winding gear behind it, making
Yeah.
it very if only they'd worked with what was there.
Oh, well,
there was a wonderful idea that they were. I mean, I do admire the land use consultants' plan for the, and they have a plan to keep the winding gear, and they say it could have been like Stoke's Eiffel Tower, which is very good, but sadly that didn't happen.
The world of missed opportunities. We have some questions for you, if I may. Annabelle Downs is more of a comment, but I'd like to turn it into a question. She says, the often overlooked Patricia Booth worked alongside Kenneth Booth on the landscape of Ironbridge. Memo, we need to raise her profile. Is that something, Otto, you were aware of, or is she so buried that it didn't come through in your research?
Please give me that. I didn't know that. I'm very and that's
I didn't wish to.
That's embarrassing.
No, I'm sure. Annabelle, do you want to say anything about that?
No, I didn't mean to embarrass you either, certainly, but it was an opportunity. I'll go away.
No, don't go away. But yes, it was an opportunity for failure rather than in any way criticism.
I mean, I do. I mean, it's input because it's shit. That profession. I've been, is the ambition of them in to really sort these things out, and it's it's. I mean, there are other people working on this as well as me. It's a profession which gives scope for women to really make a political difference, and the way they transform it from building gardens for the wealthy to something absolutely at the heart of economic regeneration and a political project. I don't need to tell anybody here that, but I mean it's a terrific story.
So, well, there may be. Sorry to interrupt, Helen. So there may be papers of hers in the at the archive in Merle.
Okay. Will you? Yes, I'm on it.
Good man. Thank you. A question from me, I'm afraid. Can I take you back to Telford? I've driven on the motorway past Telford so many times, ironically, on my way to Wrexham. And I have never been there. Isn't that a terrible admission? Much the same way that I've never been to Middlesbrough, but been through it on the train a few times. Anyway, you suggest that Ironbridge B was intimately tied to its landscape. Do you think that Telford's forest city, harnessing its derelict industrial landscape, is equally closely tied? And as a rider to that, are the modern residents aware of the landscape which their new town replaced?
I think. I mean, it's a very odd place to visit. And I was there visiting. I was in Ironbridge, and I hadn't really clocked. I don't drive, and it's not an easy place to get around. And I was there, and there was something called the Silken Way, and I was like, oh, there's Silken. Oh, I mean, a new town. That's why this place is so odd. And it really is formless. The original plan, it was going to have the population of Milton Keynes, but it's large. It didn't make that population. It spread out and curious. But it was. I don't know how. I don't know. I mean, I talked to a lot of people there, and one of the things about that kind of, because it was early mining, and they didn't really know. Well, when they came in, it was extremely dangerous. Someone I said they talked about their was digging in the garden, and the spade just disappeared because and they didn't know where the mines were, and there were problems with subsidence, and there are strange pools of water, and it was. And also, it was really horrible. I mean, it was, I think that the post-apocalyptic so the achievement of the Development Corporation there, I think, is, I've got a piece coming out on it, which it hasn't really been. It's not one of the ones which is written about, but I think that element of the Newtown project, not just as about dispersal, but as for economic regeneration, is something that might be inspirational. All of those Mark III new towns remain amongst the fastest growing economic areas in Britain. It looks like a success, although it's very difficult to get your teeth into.
Yes, I can believe that. Indeed. Sorry,
and actually, I'm not on top of. It's got fabulous archival records, and I think that the development corporations often were superb record keepers, but I don't have a sense of who the people really were. They're not. So if Annabelle or anybody can help me with that kind of peopling that story. I mean, of course, the landscape is, I think, about 5% of what they have to spend is on landscape. So it's a small part of the economic success is about other kinds of infrastructure, and they have an active process of regional boosting. But I think it's a wonderful model.
Can I just follow up on the one thing very quickly then? The new towns as record keepers, were they keeping records of where they were going, or where the site had come from?
No, I don't. I mean, I'm just, I think it's 180 boxes in the Shrewsbury archive. I've done. I think a lot of the work, so Middlesbrough, I went to the papers there, and it's very, they don't operate in a very different way, a local authority.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, I'm sure it's going to skewer the way that we tell urban histories. So I mean, the frustration of my days both in Stoke or Middlesbrough archives, and decisions are made. I think, I mean, that may be a response to the democratic deficit of a development corporation, but that they're acting. I mean, also that they have to justify themselves to central government. So it's a totally different thing to the often often big decisions, which you can, the evidence is there when you walk around and you try and find evidence for it. It's a single sentence in the minute book.
Thank you. Mike says, early industry of Ironbridge and Coalbrookdale later spread much more widely across what became Telford. The Glynwood Ironworks at Ketley, much further north, is just one example of ironworks, several of which were still in operation as the new town developed. Sorry, my computer's just lost me the information. 2 of the deep pit coal mines were still in operation into the 1970s. The ironworks at Horsehay West, I hope I pronounced that right, west of Dawley, were famed too. It will be informative to consider how the landscaping of the new town did or did not affect areas such as these. The town park contains mine waste tips that have been left and planted over. The Telford Development Corporation celebrated a former mine owner, Isaiah Jones, who had been their deputy chairman, by placing Isaiah's stone on a retained pit heap overlooking the emerging new town. In other areas, the industrial landscape was flattened to provide space for housing and industry. What scope do you envisage for a closer study of the extent to which the new landscape, here's an interesting word. Are you there, Mike? Can you just translate the re bit at the end?
I didn't finish.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Would you like to finish now?
It sounds like Mike knows more about this than I do. So let him. You can.
There's always one person in the audience, isn't there?
I'm just a bit of background is I worked for the Development Corporation from 1972 to 1981. When I arrived to work in the Social Development Department, running their research group, there was short of space, so I shared an office with the Chief Landscape Architect, Dave Wassell, as they were drawing the plan for Forest City, and the whole of the landscape team were collaborating to draw that plan. But I do think it's interesting to examine the extent to which the landscape hid the industrial history, or at points actually highlighted it. And I think probably both those things are present, but I just wonder whether you explored in that kind of direction. In that, I think my main point is not all about Coalbrookdale and Ironbridge.
Certainly. It's
industry spread over 3/4 of the area, and some of it is large scale and much later. In fact, surface open cast coal mining just west of the city centre in the 1970s. So, there's several industrial histories, and the landscape probably treated differently in each of those areas. Sorry, I'm saying.
Well, Mike, let's have a chat about this. At some, you're a useful source. That's fantastic. I should. Very pleased to meet you. I think there's this moment. I don't know. Maybe you were there, but there's this moment where the landscape team from Milton Keynes comes to Telford, and they're just like, "Wow, this is so great up here. You've got so much more potential." And I mean, that's sort of. I mean, I'll see. I've got a piece coming out about the leisure potential of that kind of, and I think that moment in the 1970s that's one of the things that's coming that is sort of firing an idea of potential that we're entering what Michael Dowd called the age of leisure, and that this would that you'd work with what was there. And these places which are being reinterpreted, and and Telford is incredibly ambitious, and I do. I don't know whether it's very funny when Milton Keynes comes and they're just like, "Oh, you're so lucky you've got this abandoned pit," and that is a reinterpretation. And of course, the story is going on of the birth of industrial heritage at the same moment. So it's an inspiring place, and it's nice to meet a veteran.
Be pleased to talk more. Helen, could I just make a different point about the earlier point Otto made about the archives of Telford? I think the main reason the archives are so good is that our registry of shared filing was run by a trained librarian and a trained archivist rather than administrators. So they ran it as a potential archive, and one of them then subsequently worked for the Shropshire Archives. So that is probably the main reason the archives are so good.
But it's sort of true of other development corporations, but you can feel that it's not been fully catalogued yet. But I can anyone looking for a PhD subject, it's a it's a marvelous thing.
Mm.
It really is. So yeah, the unsung heroes. So, whoever was putting it, my thanks.
Mike, thank you so much for that. That was brilliant. Thank you for unmasking and talking to us.
Will you send me an email, Mike? I put the.
We can do the dating agency bit.
Just let me have your email address, and I'll if you put it on the chat, maybe.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
I always think of Milton Keynes, to extend the egg metaphor, is a bit like spaghetti carbonara, or is that a really unfortunate parallel? Anyway, moving swiftly on. Ginny says, and I think this could be another really interesting contact, my partner is originally from Kidsgrove, just north of Stoke-on-Trent, so I've become familiar with the area. Over 13 years or so I've been visiting regularly. There's been a notable deterioration in the town centre in Hanley. It's become like a ghost town. Sorry, it seems. Sorry, can I just readjust my set? Go to town. My impression is that big out-of-town retail parks may be to blame. For a city with a series of town centres, I've been told Hanley especially used to be very different. It seems such a shame because I can see it could be a place with much to offer, surrounded by some lovely countryside and canals. Any thoughts?
I mean, I realised as I was giving that, and it's very, Stoke really doesn't need someone to say, oh, what a, but and what should come, maybe didn't come across, is that I absolutely adore it there. I've really fallen for it. I've been spending quite a bit of time there, and I find it sort of, I find its disconcertingness very, very exciting, and the fact that there are moments of beauty and some wonderful buildings there, and it's sort of unknown, and then just the depth of that industrial history and these sort of and that is, I find it very exciting. I can tell I've been teaching this course called Architecture and Urbanism in the Midlands for my history of art third years. I took to Stoke-on-Trent, and I sort of, I think I may have convinced some to share my excitement for it, but it's a tough sell, and and they continue to each time I wish preservation had been. We've just got the beautiful 60s library up at the 20th Century Society, which has been shut down, and I think is on the way out unless we can put a listing thing in, and it has had a random fire, and I think that sort of thing happens quite a lot. And so it's a tough place to love, but I hope it wasn't just. I don't want my talk just to be that kind of Richard Crossman idea that it should be evacuated. It's got a lot to say for it.
Yeah, thank you for that. Helen asks, were development corporations funded better than local authorities and had legal responsibilities for archiving project documentation? Sorry, Helen, I hope I've read that appropriately.
Oh, that's very yes. Actually, I mean, Mike's answer to that I thought was actually was really helpful, and thank you, Tim. That's good. That's a good answer. And actually, there was but people are going to begin to, there's a lot of very good historical work coming out of it at the moment, and I think it's not, although Telford, as far as I feel, Telford's going to be my one at the moment, but I mean that there are other people working on all sorts of, there's terrific work on lots of them, and including brilliant work on the Scottish New Towns. And I think at some point there's going to be it's going to be unbalanced, because it's a very small, it's an unusual part of urban development.
Sorry, I think we've also had the word development corporations funded better than local authorities. Have we been there yet?
I think that was the one we just had.
Yes, that's fine. And then Tim's comment for archiving in new towns, see records management, PhD by David Robert Briggs. Is that any relation to historian Asa Briggs?
I don't know.
Tim, do you want to tell us, or is that irrelevant to tonight's talk? Probably is. Ginny says, thanks for coming back, Ginny. I agree with a lot of what you say, Otto. My own feelings about Stoke are very mixed. And I think that is our last question. Can I just perhaps, again, from the landscape point of view, ask one more? Is that both Stoke and Telford are constructed on former industrial landscapes. How different are the resulting new towns? How much is due to the differences or the similarities in their industrial past, and how much is due to differences in development corporations, planners, and so forth?
I mean, there were a lot of constraints in Telford. They had this thing called the measles map about and there were places you couldn't build. And I think that's pushing it, and certainly the coal under is why Stoke is dispersed. But I suppose my larger sort of push for here is that this is true for all, that this is 20th century urban history happens in places with existing environmental histories, and you can't tell it. That's what's exciting about it. And I think so much of our of especially urban history is talked about in places that are completely new. What I'm excited about at the moment is that feeling of palimpsest.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you very much. Ginny has also said thank you so much for a fascinating talk, and I think we would all say the same. Annabelle, are you there? Can I pass this back to you?
I am indeed. Thank you. Thank you, Otto, so much. That was really brilliant. I think, and what's really exciting is that we've got Richard Flenley, who was part of the land use consultant team at Stoke, who's given us a talk, but he's available to, he was part of that original group. And also
you're taking their archives, which I've used a bit. Am I right?
Oh, right. I don't know. There was sorry, I'm not sure how much I can say about this. There was some slowness of acceptance of their archive at by Merle.
Okay. I mean, I've been through it. It's an amazing thing, and they were doing, because they were the consultants for the coal board.
Yes.
Extraordinary things.
Yes. Oh, fantastic. Oh, brilliant. Well, if you can let Merle know how wonderful it is. They need an academic rubber stamp to get it through. And the other person is Alan Simpson, who was landscape architect at Telford. I don't know if you've spoken to him or not.
No, I haven't.
I think we need to do a whole big session on Telford. I think that would be fantastic. And I think each of these talks then has spun out tentacles to other things, which is just so brilliant. So Otto, thank you for opening our eyes and our hearts.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed it. That's great. That's great. Thank you, everybody.